Sonic X Shadow Generations has already been out for nearly half a year. Oh man, that's a thought. Instead of thinking about how fast time is moving, I thought it would be nice to look through some unused content that was found deep in the game's files. Yep, a handful of stuff has already been found, and while the unused content uncovered is not nearly on the scale of unused content found in games like Sonic Frontiers, at least not yet, there's still some pretty interesting stuff in here, including some unused levels. So let's get into it. First up, we have some unused audio, and not much has been found as of now besides some lines Shadow was originally going to say at the end of certain boss fights. Here's the first one.
I am the true ultimate life form.
I think this was supposed to be said at the end of the Bio-Lizard fight because if you didn't know, the Bio-Lizard canonically was the original ultimate life form, or at least it was supposed to be, before Shadow was created. So Shadow calling himself the true ultimate life form is supposed to be some kind of jab at the Bio-Lizard, I think. Here's the second one.
If that's all you've got, you're no match for Sonic, much less me.
This was 100% supposed to happen after the Metal Overlord fight, because throughout the fight, Metal Overlord mentions how no one can defeat him, not even Sonic. So this is just Shadow replying to that, it seems. Here's the last one.
The ultimate power has already been perfected.
By process of elimination, I guess the only possibility is that this was supposed to be at the end of the Devil Doom fight, since he already had a closer for Mephiles that made it into the final game. I can see why this one went unused though, because he has much cooler dialogue at the end of the Devil Doom fight in the final release. Alright, so the next stuff is kind of boring, I'll admit, but it's still kinda interesting, so let's talk about some unused text. Yay! A couple of blocks of text were seemingly shown in early playtests for the game. One details the abilities of the Doom Surf and says Shadow can now move freely on the water. Some areas are inaccessible because they are under development, implying that in early playtests, a lot of the areas simply didn't exist in the white space yet. There's another line that I'm assuming popped up after you beat Space Colony Arc Act 1. It says the act is still in development. In Act 2, Shadow will get a glimpse of a mysterious new power. Complete this stage to move on to the next. Yet again informing the player that, hey, shit's not finished yet. Check back later. Then we have some unused lines from the Metal Overlord fight that were probably never recorded. One says, "You're no match for me, I've become the true Sonic, the ultimate life form," and the other says, "At my speed, Rommel might fly your way, try not to get hit." I'm not really sure why these were removed. I mean, they don't seem out of place to me, but I suppose it doesn't change anything either. But apart from some unused tutorial text and some simple demo leftovers, the only other somewhat notable find is that there's an unused rich presence value, which if you didn't know, Steam has this cool feature where it shows what you're doing in the game to everyone on your friends list. There's a value that reads Exploring Kronos Island. This was likely used as a placeholder to test the rich presence feature. So no, it's not hinting at the fact that Kronos Island is an unused zone or anything. It's most definitely just a leftover from Frontiers. Speaking of leftovers from Frontiers, Shadow Generations has a lot of them. It makes perfect sense, as Shadow Generations was built in the same engine and framework that Sonic Frontiers was built in. So naturally, many of Sonic's abilities from Frontiers can be used with Shadow. The drop dash, lightspeed dash, spin dash, stomp bounce, and wall climbing are all still present in the game's code, and are usable to a certain extent. There are some weird inconsistencies though. The drop dash is much slower than how it is in Frontiers, meaning you have to double the speed to make it work correctly. The lightspeed dash is there, but a way to restore it hasn't been found yet. The spin dash is not the unlockable one that was introduced in Sonic Frontiers Update 2, but rather it's the one that has you roll around at a very slow pace. The stomp bounce is pretty much entirely intact and functional, but it is missing sound effects. And finally, the wall climbing works pretty well, apart from some weird physics issues. That's all of the somewhat functional moves, but there are still leftover parameters for the drift, cloud jump, parry, and dodge. To be honest, I'm glad none of these abilities made it into the final game. Shadow Generations is a drastically different game than Sonic Frontiers, especially when it comes to the core game design, so most of these moves just weren't necessary to include in Shadow's moveset. We also have some unused objects from Frontiers. We have the climbable walls, the pulleys, and some hidden objects that have to do with disabling the drift in cyberspace, and a gold trigger that ends the stage when touched. All of these objects are left over from Frontiers. The skyboxes and atmosphere conditions from Frontiers also go unused in Shadow Generations, and they're still usable in the open world area. And while we're on the topic of unused objects, we also have some that are exclusive to Shadow Generations. We have an unused spring that is fully usable, but it doesn't make any noise. We have an object that is used to test out the Doom Surf spinning abilities, and a couple of model preview objects, including one for bosses and one for characters. If I had to guess, these objects were possibly used for either development use or maybe an unused feature in the collection room. Okay, so now let's talk about unused stages, which is by far the most interesting piece of unused content in Shadow Generations, if you ask me. Now, I'm just going to put a disclaimer right here so you don't get your hopes up. As of now, there there have been no completely unused zones or anything that may hint at unused zones in the files of the game, at least not yet. It is possible that those things could be found later, but right now we only have earlier versions of existing levels along with some development stages. Starting with the development stages, there are a lot of them, but sadly none of them are accessible in the current build of the game. From my understanding, there is no actual stage data for these levels present in the game, but there are listings for the levels in the game's master.levels file, which lists all of the stages in the game. But again, as of now, these stages are not accessible in the current public release. Maybe one day we'll find a way to play these stages, because I'm pretty intrigued to see what was going on in these levels. Okay, now for the grand finale. We have a completely early beta variant of Space Colony Arc Act 1. The stage in the final game was really good, and I think it's one of the best opening stages in Sonic history, and part of that was because of the level design. So it's really interesting to learn that the stage's level design was once much different in some parts of the level. First, the rails at the beginning are different, with fewer opportunities to jump. It also seems that it was supposed to start much closer to the arc itself, when in the final game, it has a cool little cutscene to start the stage instead. As we move further down the path, we can see some slight terrain differences, and some missing platforms, but nothing too crazy. The rest of the normal Space Colony Arc area is pretty much the same, minus all of the missing objects and enemies, of course. But then we move on to the Doom Zone, the Radical Highway area of the level. By far, the coolest part of this part of the level, for me at least, was the part that had you sliding down that massive warped building. So it's really cool to see that in this early version of Space Colony Arc, that section was supposed to be much longer. It was cut down probably to make the whole level flow better and for the Doom section to not last for too long, and the cut section was reused for Radical Highway Act 1, so that's nice too. But that's the unused Space Colony Arc Act 1 variant. Well, actually, it didn't go completely unused in the final game. Remember that one cutscene with Sonic and Shadow fighting over the Chaos Emerald? Yep, that takes place in this unused Space Colony Arc variant. I just thought that was pretty cool. But yeah guys, that's pretty much all of the noteworthy unused content from Shadow Generation so far. As more content is uncovered, I will probably make more videos discussing that stuff as well. But before we end this video, I wanted to give a massive thanks to InvalidFile, who is the one mainly responsible for finding all of this stuff. I'll link their social pages in the description below, so go check out their stuff if you're interested in seeing some Shadow Generations modding stuff, among other things. I'm also going to link the Cutting Room floor page for Shadow Generations, so you can keep an eye out for any new unused content that may be uncovered. But that's all for me. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all later. Goodbye.